Testing 1 2 3 4. Testing 1 2 3 4. This is Louis R. Wagner speaking. I would like to reminisce a little about my childhood, about my family, about my relatives, and our places of abode, where we lived, what we did, how we got there, why we were there, and many other things, perhaps. I was born in Hibbing, Minnesota, August the 31st, 1919. My mother was on her way to Canada with trunks and luggage that were intended for use in their move to Canada. My father was still down in Kansas getting wheat crop in and anxious to go, and my mother had perhaps miscalculated her time and didn't realize that I was to be born when I did, but nevertheless I was born in Hibbing, Minnesota, and I probably lived there for several months before going on into Canada. My father, my grandfather and grandmother, and my mother, of course, and an aunt and uncle and two uncles homesteaded on four corners of a section line, each taking a quarter. And my father lived there for almost 5 years, and he was reluctant to become a citizen of the Crown, so he did not prove his claim, but sold it to a man named Mr. Haney. We visited there in the 1950s and said that we would like to look around because we have a sister and brother and had been born there, and we had lived there for some time, and they said, well, you've got to be Wagners because that's the only families that's lived here is Haney and Wagners. I don't remember too much about living in Canada. I remember several high point incidents that probably were related to me as a child, and then I also vaguely remember them. But the living in the wilds of Canada was not the most pleasant experience, I'm sure, for my parents. As a child, it was pleasant, and I think that we probably had privileges that a child in the city would not have, because we had, at 4 or 5 years old, we had axes and fishing rods and 22 rifles, and those were our toys. My mother was born in Little Falls, Minnesota, and lived in Little Falls for some time after her birth, and then they moved to Chisholm, Minnesota. Their home there was, as well as the whole city, was destroyed by a disastrous fire that had been raging in the woods for several days, and it was determined that it would not go across the lake that it was confronting, and during the night it did. It went across and burned the whole city. And my grandfather was in the dray business, that is, he had teams of horses for various purposes and hauled people out of Chisholm day and night for a week or so as the city burned. My mother then from Chisholm moved on into Canada, and this is where they lived on the homestead until they moved back down to Little Falls after the children were all gone. My father was born in Ness County in a sod house on a claim. After they would plant their crops in the fall, they would my dad and his brother Bill and brother Charlie would go into Canada and cut pulpwood all winter, and when the ground would get frozen hard, they would sled it out to the road, and then in the spring they would transport it to the Irene River and go down the river with the logs. My mother was a cook on a wanigan, which is a tent-type city made up the bottom of rafts and then a tent on top of that, and there would be a cook shack and a sleeping quarters, and the whole thing was called a wanigan. My father was taking logs down the river and met my mother. They corresponded for a year or so, and then were married on June 16th, 1916, and immediately caused disruption in the family because they were all French. My father was German and understood a little German but didn't talk any, and they were all French and talked French and were Catholic, and my dad was a Protestant, and so it didn't sit with the family at all. My father was greatly disappointed that he was not accepted. They got married again, perhaps a year later in Fargo, North Dakota, in a small chapel, Catholic chapel there. My mother and father then went on into Canada and consequently homesteaded on the claim, but never proved it up. My grandfather stayed there along with an aunt and an uncle, and they proved up a claim, and in fact one of their sons, Clement, bought up all this property that was homesteaded by relatives and my father and mother, and he still lives there on the home place. The original house that my grandparents built was the first frame house in that western Ontario. In fact, one of the first houses in western Ontario. A nice, large two-story house where the whole family lived. They built a large log machine shed, and they forged their own tools, and for quite a number of years worked oxen and rather than teams of horses because they were more practical to work oxen. They cleared the land and then farmed it, and the land is still being farmed by cousins once removed. I'm sure that our days in Canada to my parents many days were dark and dreary because there was very little to do, but we as children seemed to enjoy every day of it. We had very little to do in the house, but we'd go out in the wintertime and play in the snow and hunt and hike, and had very few responsibilities. We my older brother, at least, Chris, began school there, and during the wintertime we had a dog and sled that would take him about half a mile to the school, and when school was out, we'd turn the dog and the sled loose to go to the school and pick him up and bring him home. And I frequently would go on the sled to meet him, and we'd both ride home on this sled, which caused us problems at times. The dog loved a good big gentle dog, but he loved to chase horses, and chasing a horse in a sleigh loaded with logs, one evening the dogs ran under the logs, and my brother, standing up on the back of the sled, hit his head on the logs, and it created a lot of blood and a lot of concern, but it healed in a short time, and he carried a scar for quite a number of years. My parents and other relatives in this area were some of the first settlers in Western Ontario, and my grandfather's home and his relatives are being considered for pioneers in that part of the country, and instrumental in the settling of Western Ontario. We had very little to do as children, and we frequently walked in the woods, and we chopped down trees. We made the bow and arrows and slingshots and all the other things that we could put together. We learned to whittle and make willow whistles, and my father and others were very adept at whittling, and we learned to whittle a lot. We had our own knives, even though we were probably less than 5 years old. We had a knife, an axe, and a .22 rifle. And there was a lot of game in the area. That is, a lot of moose and deer and bear, a lot of game birds, and my parents, as well as others in the area, killed deer and bear and a lot of the game birds for food only, never killing for the sport of it. And of course, the bear rugs and the deer rugs were always welcome to put on the floor to lay on and to enjoy. And that was the only meat that was provided to us. Deer meat is so lean that you had to kill a bear in order to get enough fat to fry the meat. And birds in the wintertime were quite plentiful, and if we desired a roasted partridge or some other type game bird, Mother would step out the back door of our cabin and shoot one, bring it in and clean it and dress it, have it ready for our evening meal.
This is younger sister, only sister, Irene Genevieve Wagner Trainer. I was born in Canada in the log house on September the 7th, 1921. As we lived there for another 2 or 3 years, I don't remember anything about living in Canada. And my first memories are of riding on a train with my mother and a baby sister as we were on our way to Valley Junction, Iowa. But a lot of what I will tell you for the early years of my life are things, too, that my mother used to tell me. As I was the only girl with 3 boys, I stayed in the house with my mother, and my 3 brothers got to go out and play. But I was a pretty good tomboy. I could play ball and play kickball and walk on stilts and jump rope and do all kinds of things, climb trees. We went to Valley Junction, Iowa, and it is now called West Des Moines. And how far it was from Des Moines, I don't remember. And I figure from the different dates that I do recall that it probably was in the fall, because my baby sister was with us. She was a twin that was born on the 29th of February and the 1st of March in 1924. It was a little boy and a little girl, and the little boy died after 3 days. And the little girl, as my mother told me, was always sickly, and I can't even remember her name. Also, while we lived in Canada, after I was born, My younger brother Floyd, Ezra Wagner, was born on November 26, 1922. And then in 1924, on the February 29th and March 1st, the twins were born, 2 months premature. As the little girl went with us to Iowa, I remember that she was sick, and I remember taking a trolley ride or streetcar ride with my mother into the hospital to see the little baby. And I remember when she died that she was home in a little white casket, and remember riding in the car that was provided. And at that time when older women were in mourning or at a funeral, they wore black veils, and I remember my mother wearing a black veil. I have a picture of my three brothers and I when we were little, taken in Valley Junction. And I thought that Louis had this picture also, but I find out that he doesn't, and I'm still going to get a copy made for him. We'll see. But on the back of it is the date that my mother had written. And if I recall now, it was April the 12th, 1924. No, April the 12th, 1925. I can remember playing outside a lot there, and we lived in the upstairs of a big 2-story house. Our dad worked in a cement plant, and he worked nights. And I suppose we were supposed to be quiet, and so that he could sleep. And I remember as you could go downstairs, you could look out the window, and there was a big apple tree. And sometimes we would get, not knowing any better, probably we were told not to eat them, but we did it anyhow. We would eat green apples. They tasted good, but with disastrous results.
Coming from Canada and living in Iowa was a complete change of pace for us. We were used to walking in the woods and doing what we pretty well pleased, and so we occasionally would sneak away from home and go down to the Walnut Creek and swim, and we'd come home and getting ready for bed, we'd have the sand in our shoes and sand in our underwear, and Mother would scold us again for going down to the creek, but that seemingly it didn't prevent us from going. We continued to go, and the only thing that we were more cautious about was not leaving telltale signs of sand in our underclothing and in our shoes. Brother Chris and I started to school in Des Moines, or Valley Junction. I guess it's called West Des Moines now. Valley Junction then. Started to school in Valley Junction, and I'm sure that to the teacher's dismay, we were certainly roughhouses. We had not known being cooped up in a room or authority of any degree, and so I'm sure that the teacher had quite a time with us. Chris had a little over a year of school in Canada, but no records were kept, and so it was not recognizable in the United States, and we had to start school together again, and we went all through school together. We finished about the second grade in Des Moines, and then family moved to Hibbing, Minnesota, where we continued in school. I remember our school was Cobb Cook grade school. We lived in an area called Homemakers. Our father did various odd jobs, mostly with concrete. He was very adept at working concrete and enjoyed that greatly. The times were pretty rough then, and we had very little money, but we had a family of love and fellowship, and we certainly enjoyed that. The school system in Hibbing was not supported by the city necessarily, but supported by taxes from the mines, which proved to be an abundant source of revenue for the schools. They were unique in the United States and probably the foremost school system in the country, studied by many colleges as an example. We had many innovations back in the early 20s that were not known anywhere else in the country. We had a free lunch program. We had dentists in each school and nurses in each school. We had a doctor at the high school. We had a bank system where we could deposit pennies, nickels, and dimes one day a week, and it would be recorded by our commerce classes and taken to the high school and put in a bank. And we had bank accounts. Each child had a bank account just as you would have a bank account today. We grew gardens in the early spring, and in the fall these were harvested, the carrots and the turnips and other vegetables, and made into vegetable soup, which was cooked at the high school by the cooking classes and brought into the grade schools for a hot lunch program, probably one of the first lunch programs in the United States. We had lyceum numbers with at the high school, where all the children of the school system would gather in the high school auditorium, and we enjoyed many of the plays from Broadway and musicals and other forms of entertainment, and many times an educational nevertheless, the advantages of education in the schools in Hibbing were great. They had one of the first community colleges in the country. It was an extension of the high school. It was a unique system. Like I said, it was studied by colleges throughout the United States as an example of the perfect system.
I must return in my memories to Valley Junction. One thing that stands out from all my years is the time that my little brother Floyd and I probably was the instigator, we took rocks and broke basement windows on this house that we lived in. It made a beautiful sound, just that cracking and breaking glass, and we were just having a joyous time until we were confronted with our misdemeanor. And I think we probably had the biggest spanking of our lives. And I don't ever remember breaking another glass intentionally the rest of my life. I started school in Hibbing on my birthday when I was 5 years old. I went to kindergarten. And I remember my mother taking me to enroll me. And we rode the bus. I don't know whether we were gone all day in kindergarten or whether we were gone a half day. I think probably we were gone all day. And I can remember, and all through my school years, I was very shy and intimidated, but a real achiever, because I could make good grades, and I made them. So I tried, and I did. And I remember one time when we didn't go to school because it got 42 below outside, and we always had to stand out along the side of the road and wait on the bus, and it was not safe for children to be out at that temperature. That was before they knew about wind chill. So what it was, wind chill, I have no idea. And so we were not in school for a couple of days until the temperature moderated a little. But as Louis has said, we had dental attention. We had long sinks in the hall, and after our lunch, we would take our toothbrush, and I guess we were furnished toothpaste, and we went out in the hall, and everybody stood by a faucet on this long sink, and we brushed our teeth and rinsed our mouth. And I don't know, I suppose we had some place in the schoolroom to keep our toothbrush, but we used it every day. And you would take part of your lunch. You would take a sandwich and maybe an apple or whatever you could bring from home, and then you would have this bowl of soup. And one kind of soup that stands out in my mind is corn soup. And I dearly loved corn soup. Also, on our school days, I remember, I don't know whether I was kindergarten, first grade, or second grade, but I was playing on a teeter-totter. And it seemed like it was a cousin that was on the other side and bigger than me. And whoever it was jumped off, and I fell and I hit my nose, and it hurt and it bled, and I still have a faint scar to this day. And in the winter times, first they had tennis courts. In the summertime, the kids would play tennis. Never seen that before. And in the wintertime, there was a curb around the tennis courts, and they would flood it. And if you had ice skates, you could bring your ice skates, and you could skate during recess or before school or after school.
We lived in homeacres. I think that the reason homeacres was that each house was on an acre, at least an acre lot, and Father, working in construction, would bring home the materials that they'd used in concrete work to build forms with, and frequently he would build us things at home. And one fall he built a great large slide, and when it would snow, we'd pack it full of snow and then wet it down a little, and it would become slick, and we would ride down that slide, and then built up a form and filled it full of water and froze over, and we had a small ice skating rink. We were not overly adept at ice skating, but we had friends and neighbors who were, and many of the children of the neighborhood enjoyed themselves in our yard on our skating rink and our slide. As boys, we roamed the neighborhood along with other children in the area. We would go out to into the woods and dig a large cave and get down in the cave, and we would take Indian tobacco and try to smoke Indian tobacco, and we discovered that we needed a chimney, so we would drill a hole down through the dirt down to the cave and have a hole that the smoke could escape. And I'm sure that people wondered what in the world we were doing out in the woods, but we well knew. We had behind a quarter of a mile or so away from our house in Homeacres were the units called dumps, and when they began an open pit mine, the first thing they had to do was scrape off the top layer, probably maybe 10, 15, maybe 50 feet of ore that was not valuable enough to retrieve, and so they would put it into great piles out in areas, and behind our house was an area of these called dumps, and we would go to these dumps frequently and with toboggans and slide down one and slide away level and then down another one and down several of those, and you could get up quite a good speed, and a lot of our time was spent in the winter time in the weekends taking sleds and toboggans to the dumps and riding down and trudging back up and down again. We had several blocks from our home. There was a Model T Ford that had in the alley had been there for a year or so, and the wheels were gone, and the motor had been stripped, and there was just a frame and part of the engine and a few fenders and a bunch of junk. The gas tank was gone, and the gas cap was gone off of the gas tank, and the curiosity got the best of us. We wondered if there was any gasoline in it, and you really couldn't see into the tank, so we knew it had probably been empty for several years, but my brother got hold of a match and to look down in the tank, and the minute that the match got close to the tank, it exploded and right the side of his face, and it healed well, except in the summertime you could see that his face would get red on that side before it turned brown, quite red, and in later years it didn't show at all. We were kind of wild kids. We'd come from a country where it didn't matter where you went or how far you went, just so you were home in time to eat meals and so on. And we were disciplined, but we were not disciplined to the woods and other people's property. And we had 22s, and we thought we used them quite wisely. But in hunting near the dumps one afternoon, one of the 22s went off, and I caught a bullet through the leg, kind of a flesh wound really, and went into the doctor's office and had it swabbed and cleaned out, and